Molo, Uitahane, Dumelang, Sawubona. I hope you enjoy the session. We'll be covering quite a lot, but mainly we'll be looking at looking or obtaining literature, doing the literature review. Now, I thought it is important to include that also because to get papers for your literature reviews or your review papers that you plan to do, you need to know how to search the literature. That is very, very important. And then we'll also be looking at how to critically read papers and also how to critically think about your work. Now, I want you to remember also that there's a lot of workshops internationally. There's also on the YouTube, there's various articles written on these type of topics. So besides attending, my workshop, I will also recommend you to continuously, update your knowledge, attend workshops, learn new skills. Because at the beginning of your career, the younger you are, it's very important for you to accumulate as much skills as possible. And for you as young researchers at this honors phase, I would also recommend you that you make a list of the skills that you need. Now, at honors level, it's important for you to learn how to search the literature, how to critically think, obviously, but also how to learn to write papers. This is very important. The earlier you start publishing your work, the better for your career if you plan on staying in academia. Also very important is to learn how to communicate well, how to design a poster effectively, how to, for example, present an oral presentation at a conference. These are all important skills. And then you also need to learn different laboratory-based skills, different techniques that you need to use for your research, statistical analysis, and also planning your work. Also, you need to understand also the financial aspects of ordering chemicals and planning your research so that you can finish in time. We'll not be focusing on that too much today, but I'll give some examples. So let's jump in. First, let's look at what we will be covering today. So we'll be looking at how to search the literature, and then how to use keywords or search strings effectively to search the literature, and then how to critically read a paper. Now, what I would also like to mention that UNISA is also offering a workshop in the use of AI, artificial intelligence, for research. Now, if you look at the calendar, I cannot remember the exact time, but I would highly recommend you also to attend these workshops because there's a lot of different AI tools nowadays available, like Research Rabbit and Elicit, and there's a number of those available that can also help you to search literature and to kind of help you read the paper. But with AI technologies, one has to understand the pros and cons of the different types and also how to use them. And sometimes they can also make mistakes. So the human aspect of understanding and reading a paper is still important because you need to learn also how. Sometimes people look at papers and then they will only look for the information that is provided in there. But if you critically read a paper, you can already learn how people formulate the introduction. What do they include in their method section, for example? How do they report on statistics? How do they compile figures and tables? So this is very important for you also to learn. Now let's look at first looking at the literature. Now, remember one day when you will hand in your thesis or your dissertation for examination, the examiners or even the reviewers, very important when you're handing or you're submitting a paper for publication, they will want to look and know and see that you have done a very thorough literature overview, that you understand your topic and you understand the gaps in the knowledge. So in many papers, you will notice sometimes at the very beginning stage when people are learning how to write, they will write, for example, the introduction, and then they will give a brief overview of what has been done. and kind of what they are going to do. Like they give an overview, a background of their study, and then they'll focus on what they've actually done. What people miss, and this is very, very important, is to include in your introduction section or in the literature review of your thesis, where is the gaps in knowledge. So you give the background details so as to show the reviewer or the examiner that you did a good search and you read a lot of papers, but you also need to highlight what have these people not done that you are going to address. So this is why it is important. Reading the literature helps you answer reviewer questions as well. For example, if you are at a conference, someone may ask you a question about your research, and if you don't know the literature, then you may not be able to answer these questions also one day at your oral defense. So it's very important that you have a good knowledge base of all the literature out there regarding your topic. Now, remember also, research is carried out primarily to improve the knowledge. You want to build on the knowledge. So that's why it's important to highlight in your literature review or in the introduction section of your paper what have the researchers previously done and what is the gaps in knowledge, to kind of motivate why you are doing the study. Remember also, all research builds on established knowledge, okay? And the literature review basically helps you in familiarizing the extent of the knowledge in the field, okay? It also traces the progress of knowledge and the relation between their various thoughts. It helps also in establishing the limits of the available information and identify gaps. This is important. Sometimes the reviewers or the editor will come back to you, or even the examiner, and mention, but you didn't address the limits of the information, where's the gaps in knowledge, you didn't highlight this. And also, this also links to the novelty of your work. And in research, especially when you publish your work, addressing or highlighting the novelty of your work and the research gaps that it addresses is very, very important. Now, the mistake people also do is they start the literature review at the beginning and then they forget about it. And then by the time they hand in the thesis, their work may be kind of old news. There may be other studies that have already been published. And one has to remember also that there's a lot of journals out there. They receive thousands of papers every day. Publication is massive. So that's why it's important to, when you plan your research, for example, you can use an Excel sheet, and then you can plan, for example, okay, you know, now this is the time that you have for your study. And then you plan, okay, in month 1, I will do my literature review. In month 2, I will start my experiments. In month 3, I will process my results. In month 4, I will start writing it up. But then again, make also time within every month to look at papers that have been published. You will have to continually read the literature, because there's a lot of papers being published, and something related to your research may also be published. Sometimes the reviewers can also note this. They will highlight then, or the examiner will mention that this is a recent study. You haven't mentioned this in your report. So how does this work differ from yours, etc., etc. So as I said, remember the publication volume is huge, and you need to check. Okay, is there anything being published? And you need to keep updated, because if there is something, then you need to also highlight this in your work, in your literature review, or in the introduction section of your paper, that yes, this paper has been published, but this is how my work kind of adds novelty to that has already been published. Okay, then also having like a strategy is very, very important. You have to decide which keywords are you going to use, which websites are you going to look at, and you need to write that down, because over time you can get confused where you searched and which keywords you used, and then it all becomes a mess. So let's look at the benefits of building a good search type of strategy. So it will prevent you from duplicating. It will save you a lot of time also. And it's also by synthesizing the information from previous studies, you will be able to provide a stronger background, as we already said, and justification of the novelty of your work. And remember also, if you find relevant studies to your work, it can also provide valuable insights and tips to make your own work better. So that's why critically reading these papers is very important, because then you kind of get an overview of what is being done in your field. And don't always trust the study. Things can sometimes, researchers can make mistakes, they can use the wrong techniques. So if you have a broad overview of what is going on in your field, you can easily pick up mistakes. You can build on that. You can mention that this study did this, but you recommend that this is a better technique. So always also when you write, remember not to be very critical of other studies, but to kind of formulate it in a kind of objective, positive way. Okay. Yeah, I think we've covered everything. Now let's move. Let me just check. Okay, then also if you're new to a field, you can also learn the kind of terminologies used in a field, because that is also important. For example, one day when you submit a paper to a journal, then you need to understand, is this journal kind of publishing multidisciplinary works coming from different types of fields? And then you need to kind of understand the terminology, because if you're publishing in such a multidisciplinary journal, then you need to kind of explain terminology that other people may read that are not specialists in the field, that they may not understand. So that you also need to keep in mind. For example, if you're going to publish in a specialist journal, then it's no need to define or describe your subject terminologies, because people will already be familiar with that. So that's just a point to remember also for future. So the subject specific journal, you don't have to explain too much of the specific terminologies in your field. But if you're publishing in multidisciplinary where different fields collide, then you need to kind of be a little bit more explanatory. So now let's look at the approach. So normally you will start with your question. You will have a research question. Now, compiling a good research question is also another skill that one has to learn. Is it doable? Is it feasible in the time that is allocated to you? Do you have the equipments and the chemicals available to you to effectively complete the research? Is your supervisor knowledgeable in this field? And also, is it good enough? Is it publishable enough? And also, when you start with your research, you should also think forward. Is there a kind of future for you in this? Can you link it, for example, one day if you go on to a master's and PhD, can you liaise with, for example, industry? Can it be a product that you develop from your research? So this is also a skill you need to learn to optimize your research question, that it's clear. And there are also workshops offered on that to compile good and clear and feasible research question, but we're not going to go into that. Now, then also you need to decide where you are going to search, because there's a myriad of research engines available, and also AI tools that you can use. Learn how to use them effectively. There's a lot of videos on the YouTube available, and there's also workshops offered by UNISA. Then also very important, once you have now decided, you have your question now, you know where you're going to search, you need to know the search strategy. So what is that? The type of keywords you're going to use, and the type of search strings you're going to use. Very important. It's important to keep records and to use bibliographic tools so that you can organize your references. Now, where do you search? So journals is very important. Then you can also look when you're moving on to deciding on which keywords to use. You can get a paper in your field, and then you can write down the keywords listed in this paper, and then you can already start making a list of keywords generally used in your field. But we'll go into a little bit more detail on that. Also, then you can also sign up for citation alerts, and also to journal alerts to get an email including the table of contents of a journal. So the most important place, or the information that you should get from is journals. This is very important. And look also whether the journal is accredited. Is it in the ISI or IBSS databases? Also, UNISA has list of approved journals. This is important that you check and you look for studies in such journals. Also look at the impact factor of the journals. Normally, you want to look at high impact factor journals to, learn how to write good and high impactful research. So that's also something to remember. Sometimes you get a lot of predatory journals. Be careful of that. The quality of research may not be so good in that. Now, there's a lot of different websites out there. And remember, each of these can also be field specific. So, for example, PubMed and these types of search engines is more for in the biomedical or in the medical fields, whereas Scopus and ISI Web of Knowledge and Google Scholar is more in the sciences. But it's always good to use a broad overview, because there might be a link also in your work to medicine or some other field, and then it's important for you to use this wide array of databases to search. Now, here's an interesting paper. I would recommend you to go and read this. Here they ask, which is the best search engine for an effective literature search research in, for example, laser medicine. Here's another one. Which academics are suitable for systematic reviews? This you can also go and read. But why am I mentioning this? Because some people only go and look at one search engine. They will, for example, just use Google Scholar to look for research, or they will just use Scopus, and they may miss out on studies because these search engines differ in how they are set up. For example, if you look here, let me make it a bit bigger. If you look here at the number of journals these different search engines covers, one can clearly see the difference here. There's also differences in focus on field. Okay, the period covered also, the databases covered, okay, and what they include. So that's why it is always advisable to use a wide diversity of search engines so that you can pick up on the maximum of information that is out there. Okay, this is very, very important. Don't just use, for example, Google Scholar. You may miss out on some papers that may be listed in Scopus or some other website. Then also, it's not always about Google. There's also other search engines on the internet. You can start by Google, then you can go narrow it down to, for example, go into Scopus, Science Direct, etc., etc. Then there's also other educational search engines available that you might just find some very useful information. So always have a look at that. And then also, there's also a lot of other avenues one can use. One can, for example, it's very important also for you at this early stage to kind of set up for yourself a profile on ResearchGate and academia.edu, and then you can connect with other authors also and see what are they working on and what are they publishing. There's also various databases available. Sometimes, although it's old school, hand searching journals can also reveal some interesting paper. I remember back in the day when I was doing my PhD, I found a very, very interesting article that actually solved all my the challenges that I was experiencing at the time. But I found the article in an actual, handheld journal. Also, checking the references in, for example, if you find now a paper in your field, check the references, check in which journals, authors in your field publish, and then you can go and search in these journals also. Conference proceedings, you can also get a lot of information from that, but be careful. Articles published in conference proceedings may not be so high impact or at the level of articles that have been published in journals. This is very important. And then sometimes you may find also articles on preprint servers. Be careful of looking at them, because these articles have not been peer reviewed. always look at the publications that have been peer reviewed. Then you make it also something useful, you never know, in newsletters, technical reports, and actually speaking with other researchers. For example, if you meet someone at a conference who's doing similar research to you, it's important to talk to them. You get ideas also via this. Now, let's look at building the strategy. So now that you know where to go and look for information, you have all these ideas about search engines to use, journals to look at, etc., etc. Now you want to start, so you make a list for yourself. You mention, for example, use an Excel sheet. Then you mention, I'm going to search in Google Scholar. I'm going to look in Google, in Science Direct, and so forth and so forth. Now you want to start building your keywords, okay? Which are the keywords you're going to use? And now you kind of break up your topic, okay? And it's important also while you're doing the kind of literature research is also to use reference managers, because this helps you organize your references later. So let's look at some examples of how to approach this. Okay, so first you will identify, of course, you have your research question, then you'll generate a list of keywords. If you don't know which keywords to use, go and read papers that have been published, and then you can kind of get an idea what types of keywords people use in your fields. But be also very careful, because sometimes even researchers make mistakes in published research. Their keywords don't always reflect the scope of the article. So be always critical about that. When you read the paper, think to yourself, okay, did these people include the correct keywords, or should other keywords have been included? Then you make a list of your databases. And now when you're building the kind of what we call a search string, you can combine the keywords together with terms such as and or, depending on what you are looking at. Okay, and then you see the results and you make a summary. So here, for example, if your research question is about how social media impacts the usage of e-cigarettes among the youth population. Now, the keywords that you can link is you can use social networks, Facebook, Twitter, blogging. There's a whole list that link to social media. So don't only use the word social media, also make a list of other keywords linked to social media. Youth can also be teens, teenagers, it can depend. Now, also something important to remember is when you're making or compiling your research question, it's always important to be clear. Okay, when you're talking about youth, what is the age of the youth? Okay, always be very specific, be very clear, because the reviewers or the examiners may ask you, okay, this is a bit ambiguous. What do you mean by youth? Is it children? Is it teens? What is it? Okay. Then it's important to, by starting with multidisciplinary databases and using, the wide variety of them. Don't only look at Google Scholar, look at others as well. Okay. Now, sometimes it's also important to understand the difference between keywords versus using subject terms. Now, subject terms is normally assigned by subject experts. This is about being knowledgeable in the terminology of the subject, and this will narrow down your search if you look at this type of if you use this kind of term. Whereas keywords on the other side is for when you're a bit unfamiliar and you want to have a broad overview of what is there out there in your field. And as a first, you want to gain as much information as possible. Now, once you have your keywords, you have to kind of specify on the search engine what you want to search for. Now, you can use square brackets, for example, if you want to include a specific date of a publication. This is also something important to note, is you may find something interesting in older papers, but sometimes the reviewers and the examiners will mention to you that your literature is a bit old. You have to cite more recent literature. And what is also good to look at the beginning stage of looking at what is out there in your field is looking at recent review papers in kind of high impact journals. Now, one should also be careful because you also get different types of review papers, okay? But we'll look at that a little bit later on. So Okay, so if you want to look at a specific date, you can use this approach. If you want to look at papers for this specific date, then you can use this approach. Then some other approaches also, if you want to combine certain keywords, for example, you want to look at immunodeficiency, but not HIV in the title, and also not the whole term in the title, then you can also define it like that, or you can combine, you want to look for this and that, or this or that keyword. Then also using synonyms is also very important because, for example, you may pick up on papers that use one keyword, but if you don't include synonyms as well, you may miss out on that. So also, for example, if you want to use look for synonyms, you can use this tilde symbol. There's just some tips and tricks for looking for specific information. So, for example, if you want to look for papers containing a certain phrase, you can include the phrase in quotation marks. Okay. If you want to search for example, keywords in the title, you can use this approach. Okay. If you want to search within a specific website, you can use this approach. Okay, if you want to search similar websites, you can use this approach also. If you want to search for this or that, that's another method to use. Okay, if you want to exclude certain words from your search, for example, if you want to look at things about algae, but you don't want to look at TVs, then you can use this approach. Okay, when lots of words are missing, this is another way to use. Asterisks are also important. For example, if you don't know the correct terms, then you can use an asterisk, but also sometimes if you, for example, you're in the educational field and you put in a keyword like this, you will find anything with type of education, educate, so different variations of that type of word that you put in there, you will find then. Then using a number range, for example, if you're working or if you're looking for papers between different years. Okay, if you want to also look for information with a specific format, like for example, documents that are PDF files or PowerPoint files, this is approach. Now remember, these things that I'm mentioning now is more related to your Google, when you're using Google. But when you are going to Scopus and Science Direct, you will use the keywords and the search strings. Now here I'm listing examples of, for example, keywords and search strings, for example, if you are looking at neoplasms in cancer. So this is an approach how you can set up your kind of search strings or the terms that you want to look for. Now, let's look here. So they are using this word or articles with the word cancer in, or this, and then they link it. Look, interestingly, they want to look for only papers that are meta-analysis. Okay, so this is a approach, and then this is a different approach for using Embase. ISI, you want to look for things in the title, and you want to combine this and this, and look here also with the asterisk as we discussed. So different variations of that word, and you want to look for specific types of paper, okay? And here you don't want to retrieve, for example, documents that are letters or etc. You want to have specific papers, okay? So you can have a look at this examples. Now, it's also very important, for example, let's look at this example here. Now, this was for looking at valorization of food waste. Now, if you put the keywords like that, your work is specifically focused on vegetables, and you want to look at the byproducts. You want to look at the valorization of that. Now, look at if you use these keywords, you want to combine vegetable with the byproduct, or remember what we talked about, synonyms or waste. So byproduct can also have a synonym like waste. It can also be waste. People use the word waste, okay? And look at the amount of papers that have been retrieved. Now look at this one. vegetable, you want to look at specifically that and Europe and byproduct or. So if you change it to that, look, there's fewer papers. Again, here you want to look at vegetable and you want to look at, so this means you want to look for articles containing the word valorize or valorization or any variation of that form. And you want to have articles with that, but or this. Okay, so the different synonyms. And you can clearly see here the number of papers you get. So it's very important to compile the correct words and use the correct keywords, how to correctly combine them, use the correct searchings, and this will depend then on how many papers you retrieve. Also, as I mentioned, very important, you want to use different search engines for this purpose. Not only one, but you want to have a look at multiple search engines. Now, when there's a difference, for example, when you are writing for example, when you doing a literature review or you wanting to write a research paper, you will follow this approach. You will look at different search engines, you will look at Google, you will compile your different search strings, linking the words up using asterisks if you want to use variations of the word, etc., etc. And if you in Google, if you want to look for specific types of papers, you want PDF papers, then you use the approaches that I mentioned previously. But now, if you are looking to write a systematic review, you will have to use also a different type of search approach. Now, if you look at in the journals, you will find that there's different types of papers. So you'll find the research paper, and that is where you kind of communicate your research work, the results of the research that you've done. You will have a section for your introduction where you explain what you have done, what is the novelty of the work. Then you will have a section for your methodology where you explain the methods that you use, the type of samples that you collected, the experimental conditions, the type of data that you collected, the statistical analysis that you did in the social sciences. It will be different in the medical sciences. Also, the approach will be different. You will have, for example, your group of patients, where you collected them from. Your ethical clearance needs to be mentioned in the questionnaires that you gave them or the treatment that you gave them. And then also, so the methods will differ between the different fields, but you can learn from which methods are being used in your field and how they are being reported also by reading the literature. This is very important. Now, sometimes people also don't report their methods in full. Now, this is also a problem because nowadays research repeatability is very, very important. So someone else may have a look at your work and then they may want to do the same experiment, but they may do it and then they may not get the same results as you did because you did not fully outline your methodological approach. So that's why it's important when you're doing your experiments, you have a notebook also, but you can also have like a file that you online, that you share online with your supervisor so that it's always accessible. But be careful not to include sensitive data in there. For example, if you're working with patients, you have to anonymize their names. Now, this is now, but besides, I'm getting a bit off track here, but coming back to the systematic review. So besides the traditional review that you'll find in the papers, the systematic review is type of a literature review focused on a single question. So in this type of approach to a review, because in your normal review, you will have a question that you want to answer. You will want to look at, for example, an overview of what techniques has been used in vegetable valorization, and then you write an overview of this. But in the systematic review, it's like a review paper where you overview a subject, but in this type of paper, you will have a specific question. Okay, and in this type of work, you want to identify, appraise, and select and synthesize all high quality research. So then you will need a different approach. And in fields like medicine, this is generally regarded as the highest level of evidence. Now, let's just briefly compare what is the type of normal review paper that you get in scientific or social science journals and what is the systematic review type of paper. So normally in the review paper, you will have a more broad type of question. And in your systematic review paper, you will have a more focused type of question. You will have to mention your search strategy. Okay, so normally in your review paper, you will mention this review will cover this and this, or you will review this and this topic. But in the systematic review, you will have a type of question that you have to answer, and also a methodology section where you outline your search strategy, like the search engines that you use, the keywords that you use, the dates of the studies that you included, also which studies did you exclude and include and why. So this is a bit more rigorous than your review type of study. And when you look for papers related to this, I'm going to skip this a bit. You will use the term this systematic, so that you specify in your search engine that you want to specifically look for systematic reviews on this topic. And then you will also see that far less papers are found than if you just search for this term. This is also mentioned here in, if you look at this, these people specifically looked at meta-analysis. So this is where you want to retrieve data also from the papers that you want to have. And then you kind of do statistical analysis on this data as part of the systematic review. So you don't just answer a question, you also analyze and do a meta-analysis of the data as part of the systematic review. Okay, yeah, they also include this terminologies here because then they mention they want specifically studies on this, and this is a bit more rigorous. But as a start with a general overview of your review papers, because you can get a lot of information from this. Whereas the systematic review, you will answer specific type of questions. You will have a specific search strategy that may not be so broad. So start off with the general review, but just keep in mind, if you want to search for systematic review papers, this is the approach that you have to use, as we discussed here. Okay, always important, write down when you're doing your strategy, you write down the strategy, which the databases that you use, which to keywords, etc., etc. Now, we're done with this. If you have any questions, we can answer that at the end of the session. Now, let's move now to reading papers, why this is important. Now, I'm not going to go into much detail in here. We will share the slides with you, and then you can go through this in your own time, and then you can ask me questions if you want to. But what's the most important thing for you to remember when you are reading a paper? You need to always go back to the literature. Every month you need to check, has there been papers published in my field? What has been published? Does this overlap with my research? How can I innovate my research based on this type of what has been published? Then go and read papers in peer-reviewed journals. This is very important. You can also get information from book chapters. Dissertations can also be nice, but you want to read the journal papers, because one day it's important for you to publish your research work. Even before you even hand in your thesis, you can already, for example, publish your literature review as a type of mini review or a review paper. But then it's important to know what is out there. Okay, how do you adapt your literature review to make it novel enough so that it can be a paper? Because even if you publish a review paper, it still needs to be novel. It shouldn't overlap with other reviews that have already been published. So just remember that. Now, as I mentioned, we should focus on the journals, because why? Because when you read the journal article, you already start learning how do people approach research? How do they write up? Now, also when you look or when you find the papers, you want to see, am I reading a review paper or a primary research? Now, at the first stages, you want to have a look at review papers published in high impact journals, because this provides a broad overview of your field, what is out there, what is being done. And these review papers may also provide you with ideas for future research, or what is the gaps currently that has not yet been addressed. And this can also give you ideas for future work. Also, the way they structure review papers, you can look at the headings, what they include. This can also guide you on also how to write your own literature review, because before you start writing your literature review, you have to kind of set up like a skeleton overview of what you will be including in the review, and then you add the paragraphs, and so you continue the writing. But first you have like a type of skeleton draft of what will go into, or what headings will you have in your overview, and then you can use these review papers as a guidance. Okay, there's some just examples of the differences, but we're not going to go into that much detail now. Remember, we talked about the impact factor. Okay, now also look at how, when you read the papers, look at how the papers are kind of structured. Okay, look at how they write a title. Don't just read the title, look at how they formulate a title. Now, a title for a research paper will be more kind of declarative of the work that has been done. But check also that when you read this, sometimes people write titles that's not always completely reflective of the work that have been done. And that is very important for you to learn already now, to write a title that reflects on the work, the completeness of the work that has been done. Now, you will notice that sometimes for review papers, people will use more catchy titles, or sometimes for other types of papers, like when you write a letter, the title will be it will be more catchy to catch, kind of to get the interest of the reader. Then you also, when you look at the paper, you want to see how do they formulate the abstract. Okay, what do they include it? How do they write the abstract? Because there you already learn what should I include in my abstract. Normally I will start with my aim, where's the gaps in the knowledge, then I will move on to the methods briefly that I used, and the most important results, and then a conclusion. Now, you also get different types of abstracts. Also have a look at that. Abstracts can be also with types of headings. Some journals prefer that there's a heading background and then you write the brief background. The method, sometimes it will only be one paragraph, and the journal will also specify how long it should be. This is also very important to take note of, that when you write your own abstract and you decide on a journal, to note how long should this abstract be. Then introduction, reading it very critically, not just for information, is how do they formulate, how do they write the English, how do they build kind of the introduction towards their aims. Because when you write an introduction, you have to kind of convince the reader that your work is important, that it addresses some gap in the literature, and it links well to your aims and your objectives. Methods, also critically read what methods people are using to answer a specific question. But then you also need to be critical. You need to think, is this method good enough to answer this research question? That's why it's important to read many papers so that you can get an overview of what other people are also doing. Results, you look at very critically at the results. To see how do people summarize a table. You can learn a lot from that. How do they compile a figure? Remember, there's a difference between how you also present. If you want to show trends in your data, it's better to use a figure. But if you want to show actual, you want to scrutinize the actual results, it's better to summarize it in a table. But remember, when you also go into a conference, people don't want to read long, boring tables. Sometimes you sit at the back, you cannot see what is going on in the table. So it's better to include a visual aspect, a figure. Then very important, also understand the discussion. How do people discuss their results? Because the mistake most researchers make is they report only on their results, but they don't discuss it. What does it mean? How does it compare with the literature? Does it support it? Does it not? And if it doesn't support what has been previously published, you have to motivate why. Also look at who's in and how people acknowledge, how they format the references, etc. So this we already discussed somehow. Look at the authors, You look at the methodology, then find a quiet place to read. Now, there's different approaches to read papers. You will go through the paper fast. Maybe first you'll read the title, you'll read the abstract, but be careful. Sometimes people miss some important points in the abstract, then they forgot to include it. Even sometimes in high impact journals, you will notice that they didn't include one important aspect of their research in the abstract. So read the entire paper. Some people start with the methods, others start with the results, but normally they start with the title and the introduction, but it all depends on you. So you'll quickly read through it. You read the title, the abstract, the introduction, you read the conclusions. So you want to just see, is this paper of interest for me, or can I pass to another one? Okay. Then you also look at the references within that paper, because that can also give you ideas for other papers that you can go and look at. Then you will look at more detail a bit later on when you've now read the article, you've kind of got an idea of what it's all about. You need to think about, is the assumptions valid? Does it link back the results to the original research question? Okay. Is the paper well written? Okay, so now that you've seen this paper and you've kind of assessed it, now you decide, okay, I'm going to leave it. This may not be of interest to me, or you're going to more critically assess this. Okay, now you look at the figures and the diagrams, you look at the references, etc., etc., and this can take some time. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but this is one approach of doing this. Okay, now let's move on to the second approach. Now, this is, for example, if you're reading a review paper, you want to look at the anatomy of the paper. What type of headings do they include? Now, when you're also writing a heading for your own work, for example, if you're compiling a literature overview and you have headings within your literature review, check that your headings reflect the actual content of the paragraph below the heading, because sometimes people write paragraphs on something and then it doesn't link back to the main heading. What is the conclusion? So now you look a little bit deeper. You also look at the terminology people use in this paper. Is it subject specific? If it's a multidisciplinary journal, they will be more explanatory of different, terminologies that is specific to a field. And also you want to look at the keywords that they use. This is also very important. And yeah, as we already discussed, it's important to critically read the abstract, critically read how they formulate the title, how they write the introduction. And very important, now that you have read the paper, you want to take notes. So you want to, for example, have a shared Google file where it's available for you online, because you may lose your laptop and then these things may not be available and then you lose all the information. And in that Google Doc, you summarize your search strategy, the search engines that you use, the keywords, and then you list the paper and what was the main findings of this paper, like what methodology did they use, what was the research question, and then it's easier for you to go back later on and kind of peruse all the information. Very important, when you read, also look at the gaps at the literature, the type of method they used, what type of statistical analysis they used, and try and understand this, how they write this and why they did this, how they compared the groups, why did they compare this specific, why did they use this specific statistical analysis for comparing their data. Could they have used something else? Is it something you can use also? Then you can also discuss this with the statistician if you have questions, or with your supervisor. Very important, look at the methods, how they describe the methods. Okay. All of this is important. How they communicate the results also. It's very important also, the results section, to critically read this, because here you can find out a lot of different details about how people report on results and how they do this well. For example, if you have you've done statistical analysis on your data, you can learn how to effectively report this, how to include the p-value, how to include, write it in such a way that it's clear that the groups that you compared, the means, you have to report on the means and all of this. So read this very, very critically so that you learn how to report on the results. Also, what is mentioned in the discussion. What references do they use? This can also give you ideas for future papers that you need to read on. Now, as we said, once you've read all the papers, for each paper you read, you want to have a file where you kind of summarize the information obtained from this paper, and then you can go back to it later and so use it then for your literature review. Already start using and learning how to use bibliography tools. This will help you a lot at the end with your references. There's various diverse resources out there like RefWorks, NWord. And this is a type of example that you can use. For example, you can list the keywords in the paper, what was covered, what was the research questions, what was the gaps in knowledge, what was the methodology used, what was the results used, what was the summary of the key points, what was the significance or novelty of the study. Okay, now once you've read, sometimes reading articles can be very tiring. Sometimes you have to leave it and go back to it and look at it with fresh eyes. It's almost similar to this. Once, if you look at this image, what you see at the beginning is a duck, but when you look at it longer, you see a rabbit. This is kind of the same with the research paper. You really have to read through it in several phases, where you'll first look at the abstract, the title, and then you more critically look at how do they write in English? How do they present the flow of information? How do they write up their methods? How do they write up their statistics? How do they discuss their work? So then you learn from this. You don't only gain the information from the paper, but you actually learn how to write well. And look at journal articles in high impact factors. Now, this you can go through in your own time, because I'll be giving some examples right at the end of the presentation. But this is also very important for you to kind of develop critical thinking skills. Now, if you have developed this, you will also use this, how to critically, appraise papers, read this. Now, one skill or thinking skill that you should develop is the strategic thinking skills. Now, this can also link to your analytical skills, your communication skills, how to communicate well, especially if you are presenting work at a conference, problem solving, if you run into problems with your experiments, planning and management. And there's some other skills also linked to strategic thinking. So why is this important to develop? So this helps you to seek influence what is not in your control. You want to consume information. You want to know what's out there, etc. So this is a very, very important skill. Now, if you kind of look at your own projects in this kind of way, before you start with your project, you want to kind of set aside time, and you want to reflect really on the research question that you have now. You have to think, is this feasible? Can I do this in future? Do I have funding for this? Is this a hot topic currently in research? Is it linked to the Sustainable Development Goals or the UNISA catalytic areas? So these are all thinking skills you need to think about when you have your research question or project in hand. Then you also need to think about, what is my objective, okay? What is this that I want to address? Does it align with my organizational or their strategic or objectives? Then you want to gain information as much as possible. Okay, you want to seek information so that you are the expert in your subject area. And then once you have this information, it can also help you ask questions about your research. How can I build on this? If I know the methods used, is there another type of method that I can use to better inform my answers? Okay, so this is all skills you need to learn to survive and thrive in your research. Now, how do you improve your strategic thinking skills? By asking strategic questions by observing, okay, by considering opposing ideas. Also, it's very important to cultivate a type of strategic mindset and then to understand different types of reasoning. We'll have some examples at the end, so I'm going to skip this. Now, what is also very, very important is critical thinking skills, how to develop this. Now, also in when you write, this is very important to learn how to write good arguments. So this is a skill also that one needs to develop, okay? Um, Here is also some examples to develop your critical thinking skills. So you already start developing this by looking at how you collect information. For example, are you collecting from reliable sources? What is the search engine I'm using? What is this journal? Does it have a high impact factor? Is it multidiscipline? What type of information will I get from this? Asking critical questions. Examine all your data that you get from these papers or the information. Think, is the data that they're presenting correct? How could it be differently presented, etc. Now, also when you read the studies, think critically about what is the implications of this work and how can I build on this, etc., etc. Then you can also remember, also, critical skills also involve the ability to notice and predict opportunities. Is there maybe something that you read in a paper that may present an opportunity for you to build on your work, etc., etc. Now, I'm not going to go into this into too much detail, but you can go through this in your own time. But let's go into a little bit more about the standards. So clarity, it's very important to think with clarity, okay, with accuracy, with precision, relevance, depth, breadth, logic, and fairness. So this is all critical thinking standards. So for example, when you focus on the theme of clarity, when you're speaking to someone, for example, at a conference, when you're asking them a research question, think a bit more about, is it clear to you? Could you express it in a different way? Could you illustrate it for me? When you read also papers, think about, is it accurate? Is this method they presented appropriate for this type of work or research aim? Think about the precision of the data that is presented. This is another example. The relevance, okay? How is, for example, the literature that you are reading, is it relevant to the research question that you are going to address, etc., etc. So you can go through this in your own time, but I'll be giving now some example because I see we are running a bit out of time. So let's look at some examples of deductive reasoning. So, for example, if you look at all mammals have hair, a horse is a mammal and therefore a horse has hair. So, in deductive reasoning, when you use this type of approach, conclusions logically follow from premises that are assumed to be true. Inductive reasoning, this example, every crow observed so far is black. Therefore, all crows are black. So this involves making generalizations based on specific observations or evidence. Analogical reasoning is, for example, when you look at the structure of an atom, is similar to the solar system. And this draws comparisons between similar relationships. So this is examples of different types of reasoning that you can use. Now let's look briefly at some examples of strategic thinking. So here's an example. So for example, an honest student is planning a research project. Instead of jumping into experiments, they map out long-term goals. Okay, what will be the aim of the project, what experiments they will use, which journals they will publish in, what is their goals, which conferences they would like to attend to, is there funding sources that you can apply for a fellowship. Think about this, okay? Think about how to strategize your project. Who will you want to collaborate with in future? Will there be any obstacles? Maybe there's not chemical available, maybe there's limited funding. How you are going to overcome this, okay, and then design a timeline that aligns with the graduation. So the timeline will involve when you do your literature, when you for example, start your experiments, when you analyze your data, when you start writing up your papers, and also include in this timeline conferences that you will attend and papers that you will publish from the work. Now, all these strategies you need to think about. Is there a future for this project? Is there funding? Are the chemicals available? Okay, see the big picture in this, okay, and align your short-term actions also with your longer-term goals. Maybe this project will lead to a master's project. Let's look at the example here of analytical thinking. A student compares two data sets on bacterial growth under different pH conditions. They use statistical analysis to find significant differences, examine possible sources of error, and conclude which conditions optimally supports growth. Now, it's important when you use statistical analysis, look at previous papers in this field, what statistical analysis people use, and also consult a statistician, because statistical analysis, the type that you use, can also depend on your sample size, the groups, the type of data you're working with, all of this. So this is important. Now, the skill here highlighted is breaking down complex information into components and identifying patterns. So you have your data. Now you need to think, how am I going to analyze this? Which statistical analysis am I going to use? Obviously, I'm going to start with kind of descriptive analysis, summarizing my data into means and standard deviations, etc. And what other secondary analysis I want to use? Do I want to see patterns? Do I see correlations between my data? Do I want to see if certain variables can predict my outcome? And if it does, is there any type of factors that can influence this? Now let's look at creative problem solving. Say, for example, you faced with a specific reagent, you don't have this, then what can you do to overcome this? Can you use an alternative protocol? Is there a lab that you can maybe borrow a chemical from, or how will you kind of solve the problem? When you run into a problem, don't let it stop you. Think creatively. How can I solve this? Can I use a different method, a different approach? If something doesn't work out, it's not necessarily a bad thing. It can lead to something good. We once did a work on the antibacterial properties of nanoparticles. It didn't work out, but then we found, it has antioxidant properties and some other properties that can be used in anti-cancer research. So we didn't stop there. We thought, okay, maybe this can be extrapolated into something else. Now I'm almost done. So when reviewing a published paper, a student questions the validity of the conclusions, examines the methodology for bias checks, data, and suggests that further experiment. So what does this skill highlight here? Critical thinking. You evaluate your arguments and your evidence logically. And this is where it comes in when you're writing your discussion. You have to think critically about your results. What does this mean? Does it support other findings? Why doesn't it support it? Did I use different experimental conditions, maybe a different sample that other people didn't use? Forecasting is also important. A student anticipates how changes in climate patterns may influence the spread of vector-borne diseases in their region over the next decade based on current data. What is this skill? You want to predict future outcomes based on current and historical information. Sometimes you also have to think, when you're in a research field, how will this thing change over time? And that's why it's important also to read the review papers, because in those review papers, they may provide suggestions for future research or gaps in knowledge that you can address. Now let's look at adaptable thinking. For example, if you're doing a field study, you have a sudden weather change and you cannot collect now your data, and then you quickly redesign the methodology to collect different but still valuable data, but under new conditions. Now, this is important also. You need to adapt, because there may be challenges, and then you need to learn to adapt to these challenges, adjusting strategies and solutions in response to a changing condition. Also, if for example, your project doesn't work out, how can you adapt it, change it, so that you eventually get a positive outcome in the end? And if you are stuck, don't sit there feeling sorry for yourself. Go to your supervisor, find another strategy. Okay, I think that is all for now. If you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out to me, and or Tony will be sharing the slides also with you. Thank you so much.